man turns into a vampire after being bitten by a vampire and hides in a shed. Stanley's life gets scary when he finds out about the vampire in the shed. The story will show what happens with Stanley and his friend. At the beginning of the movie, we see a terrifying forest. A man who was scared and holding a gun ran through the woods. A vampire with no hair and big scary teeth came and bit him. Vampires drink people's blood. Before the vampire could drink all the man's blood, the sun came up and burned the vampire to ashes. The vampire was gone, but the bite turned the man into a vampire too. As the sunlight started to burn him, covered himself with his shawl and flew away to hide in a shed. After this, we saw a boy named Stanley. His mom came to wake him up for breakfast. While he was eating, he was shocked to see that his mom suddenly became very ill. Her hair fell out, and her face started turning black. Within moments, his whole family was gone. It turned out that Stanley had just had a bad dream, but in reality, his parents were already dead. Now, Stanley lived with his strict grandfather, who was a soldier and didn't get along well with him. Every day Stanley went to school. We could see that the shed where the vampire was hiding was near Stanley's house. On his way to school, some troublesome kids distracted him. Riding his bike, he accidentally crashed into a police truck with an officer and a sheriff. They were very angry and warned him that next time there would be consequences. At school, 3 troublesome boys were bothering Stanley's friend. Stanley arrived and helped his friend, leading to a fight. This wasn't the first time such a fight had happened. The teacher came and broke it up. We saw a girl named Rosie, who used to be Stanley's friend but had now joined the troublemakers. She was still with them, even though they treated her poorly. Later, Stanley and his friend went out to have some fun. His friend made a joke about Rosie, which upset Stanley because he liked her. Stanley got angry and decided to leave. His friend called him crazy and cowardly, saying that Rosie had left him for money and a car, but Stanley was still infatuated with her. Stanley said he didn't think that way. He believed everyone deserved a good life, and there was no harm in that. Even after he got home, he kept thinking about Rosie. His grandfather then called him to cut the grass. Stanley went outside to tie up his dog. The dog's behavior changed suddenly. The dog stared at the shed and barked non-stop. Feeling uneasy, Stanley decided to check the shed. Inside, he found human teeth that belonged to the vampire man, who had fully turned into a vampire. The vampire attacked Stanley from behind, but as sunlight came through the window, he began to burn. The vampire let go of Stanley, who took the chance to escape and save himself. Stanley warned the vampire to come out quietly, where he would release his dog. When the vampire did not respond, Stanley let the dog loose. The dog ran into the shed but soon came back with its head missing. Stanley was terrified, realizing the situation was very serious. He went inside the house to get weapons. His grandfather stopped him, asking about the dog. Stanley explained that a demon in the shed had killed their dog. Grandfather didn't believe him at first, but when he saw the dog's head, he was convinced. Angry, the grandfather went to the shed despite Stanley's warnings. He fell to the ground after the vampire attacked him. Stanley tried hard to save his grandfather, but the vampire was too strong and pulled him inside. He locked the shed with chains and sealed it because he didn't know what else to do. He couldn't go to the police because he was trapped in the same situation. That night, as he tried to sleep, someone began opening his door, even though it was locked. The vampire's voice came from the shed, calling him and trying to hypnotize him. Stanley felt drawn to the shed. When he opened the shed door, the vampire attacked him. But then Stanley woke up. It had all been a bad dream. The next day at school, Stanley tried to forget what happened. Rosie walked by, looking sad, and sat next to him. They talked and remembered their past. Just then, Marty, the leader of the troublemakers, came by and teased Rosie for sitting with Stanley, calling him a coward. After Marty left, Stanley's friend arrived. Seeing Rosie leave, Stanley got angry at his friend for ruining everything. He was upset that he couldn't tell Rosie about the shed. Later, Stanley's friend ran into Marty and his troublemaking friends, who beat him up badly. Stanley took a bat to face the vampire, showing great courage. But when the vampire broke the shed door and grabbed Stanley, he was terrified. Fortunately, the sun began to rise. As sunlight touched the vampire, he started to burn. The vampire let go of Stanley, and he managed to escape. Stanley was still shaken when his injured friend arrived. His friend was very angry and wanted to know what was inside the shed. Stanley told him everything, but his friend didn't believe him. He insisted on seeing the monster for himself. When he saw the vampire's horrifying face, he was scared and finally believed Stanley. After that, the two friends used sticks to cover the hole in the door. Stanley asked his friend what he should do. His friend suggested bringing the troublemakers to the shed and locking them inside. That way, they wouldn't bother anyone again, because they would die. Stanley was shocked by this idea and didn't want to kill anyone. His friend was very angry and wanted revenge, which wasn't good. Stanley was also scared that his friend might tell others about the vampire, but his friend promised not to do that. That night, Stanley watched a movie to learn how to kill a vampire. He learned 3 ways: burning it with sunlight, stabbing its heart, cutting off its head. Stanley fell asleep during the movie. In his dream, a girl came out of a poster. It was Rosie. Stanley was surprised to see her, but then she turned into a vampire and attacked. Stanley woke up, realizing it was just a nightmare. When he put on his shoes to go outside, he saw the vampire hiding below. The vampire attacked him again, and Stanley woke up, realizing it was another dream. Now fully awake, he was so scared he slept with a knife and accidentally cut himself. He decided to dig a hole in the shed's roof to let in sunlight and burn the vampire. But before he could finish, he went back home. Sheriff came out looking for his grandfather. Stanley lied and said his grandfather wasn't home to send Sheriff away. Hearing this, Sheriff began to doubt Stanley. Sheriff noticed his car was outside and asked about a family Stanley didn't know. This made the sheriff even more suspicious because the family lived close by, and someone had been killing their animals. The head of the family had gone into the jungle to find the killer and hadn't returned yet. We realized that the man running in the jungle at the beginning was actually the head of that family. As a vampire, he was hiding in Stanley's shed. Stanley was late for school and didn't answer the sheriff's questions well. Sheriff offered to give him a ride to school, and Stanley agreed. Before leaving, the sheriff noticed Stanley's grandfather's stick on the ground. At school, Stanley met Rosie, who asked if he was okay. While they talked, Marty appeared and began teasing Rosie again. This time, Stanley couldn't take it and started hitting Marty, threw Marty down and kept beating him, making Marty lose his pride in front of everyone. Stanley was so angry he almost killed Marty. The teacher arrived and stopped him. The teacher was furious and said he would tell Stanley's grandfather everything. Since the grandfather wasn't answering the phone, the teacher had sent Sheriff to find him. Stanley was very scared by this. Stanley knew it would be terrible if she reached the shed. Without thinking, he ran out of the house, and Marty followed him. When no one answered the door, Sheriff went to the shed. Seeing it was sealed, she figured someone was inside. Stanley arrived just then. Sheriff pointed her gun at him, but he tried to explain the situation. Sheriff didn't listen and opened the door anyway. The vampire came out and bit her neck. Then the vampire grabbed her gun and pulled her inside the house, leaving her hand outside. Stanley was already in trouble when Marty showed up to get revenge for being embarrassed. Stanley tried to warn him that there was a bigger problem. Marty didn't listen. He attacked Stanley and kept hitting him. To help, Stanley's friend arrived with the sheriff's gun. Marty was scared when he saw the gun but still acted bravely. Stanley tried to stop him. Marty threatened to kill him if he interfered. Marty insisted on going into the shed. Seeing the cut hand made him afraid, but he went inside anyway. As soon as Marty entered, the vampire attacked. Stanley was very upset with his friend for what happened. He didn't think Marty deserved to die for what he did. In their fight, Marty hit Stanley with the gun and knocked him out. When Stanley woke up, Rosie was standing in front of him, confused by the cut hand. Before he could explain, Stanley went to the shed with a weapon and found Marty's body. Marty had turned into a vampire. Stanley asked his friend where the vampire had gone. His friend said that the vampire had left for now, but would return to get revenge. Rosie arrived, and as Stanley's attention was on her, his friend attacked him. Stanley managed to fight back by sticking a piece of wood into his friend and burning his arm in the sunlight, causing some burns. When the sunlight hit his face, he burned badly and fell down. Stanley thought he might be dead, so he went outside to help Rosie. The vampire was about to bite Rosie when Stanley came in with a gun. The vampire moved so fast that he took the gun from Stanley and threw it away. Stanley used an axe but did little harm. The vampire threw Stanley aside and went for Rosie. She shot him, but it had no effect. Stanley threw a knife to help, but it accidentally hit Rosie. Vampire then attacked Stanley again. Rosie finally killed the vampire by using an axe to separate its head from its body. Afterward, they burned the shed with all the vampire bodies inside. They were both relieved and happy. The story of the movie ended here.